the main backgrounds questions for thinking about these issues of accountability, significance, and practicality are, are scholars isolated from the real world, and are students isolated from the real world? We have a tendency to think of students are kind of in their bubbles, but their teachers sometimes are too. So should we start thinking about changing the approach for the university? Is it changing organically? Like the previous speaker said about, because the students are changing, they are not more dynamic, they have access to more methodologies that maybe we didn't have when we were training as students. Is interdisciplinarity made possible in practice, and is it encouraged? Other questions are, who else does science and who produces knowledge, and how can we incorporate these knowledges in what we do? And further, how can we best diffuse knowledge beyond the academe, and what is our research good for? So those are 5 questions that we can also keep in the back of our mind as we go through this week. And I wanted to say a little bit about my background and what brings me to thinking about these questions, and also a caveat that while this talk tends to generalize trends, it's clear that different disciplines have developed different practices based on their different epistemologies, methodologies, and general fields of inquiries, the way they seek out different actors in their studies, etc. So some of you may recognize themselves better in some parts of the proposition, and some others in other parts. But in general, what we can say that is true for all is that we can get inspired, regardless of what disciplines we come from, to do more or better, to change the outlook onto knowledge production and diffusion, to make ourselves as useful as possible. I also, of course, will draw from my own discipline of human geography, and more widely from social sciences, but I also believe that the humanities are just as concerned and useful in thinking about these processes. I also will draw from my experience as an editor of public writing, where I learned to become this mediator and lead authors to become mediators themselves between research and academic scholarship and general audiences. Through my task as chair of the editorial committees at EuropeNet Journal, which is an online publication at the Council for European Studies at Columbia University, a journal that I invite you to visit, and where our convener, Manasi, has actually contributed before in a really good article. So I'm also influenced in my speaking by the American setting, where I did most of my higher education. So hopefully the purpose will resonate with you as scholars in India, and I'd be very interested in establishing some exchange pathways where we could also learn how things may be the same or different in your practice of European studies in India. So we have seen recently a public defiance towards science, towards the political class, and towards top-down practices. So from climate change deniers to anti-science, all sorts of fake news about the COVID pandemic. People have now more readily access to information through the internet, for example, and they formulate reactions and resistance to the information that they receive. And this has also been politically instrumentalized, which in turn feeds into a defiance towards the political class. So how can we increase public trust through what we do? Public trust in science, public trust in leaders that use science to produce policy. So what is our role there? And how can we be more inclusive of all knowledge producers? So the reality is that we have, as you know, become hyper-specialized just by virtue of the massive amount of knowledge to be acquired. So we have lost the ability to see the big picture and how ideas communicate with each other to create change for people. We speak of silo thinking and island knowledge. I like the image of archipelagos, where you have these constellations of small land masses that are seldom directly connected to each other, even if they are aware of each other and they know about each other. So how can we combat this silo mindset and build bridges across these pods of knowledge and with the outside world to make our work relevant, accountable, significant, and practical, to come back to these three concepts. So here, there are many ways to enhance relevance, but I just wanted to touch on three, which is the intersection of our research with policy, so the applicability of our research, and the diffusion of research beyond academia. And I'll talk about the role of what's been called the public intellectual and the creative scholars, which is also one way to practice interdisciplinarity. And how can we integrate those two goals of reaching out to policy and beyond academia, integrate those two goals into teaching our students? And I'm thinking about undergraduate students and graduate students, but as early as undergraduate students. I also want to talk about the feedback loops, which is when we do engage in policy and also reaching out to the public, it actually will end up making us better scholars. So if we think about policy reach and bridging the gap between our research and policy, it's been observed by people who work on this matter that the gap between academia and policy has actually narrowed, maybe in the last decade. There has been a rapid change because policymakers now recognize that they need experts and technical expertise that they don't have time to acquire. So they will reach out more to technical experts or even people who work on theories. If you think about topics like climate change or the COVID crisis, social justice, migration, you'll see increasingly, even in the media, that professors are being called on to talk about the issues. You have panels of experts that will include policy people and university people. So that bridge seems to be somewhat closing, at least as portrayed in the media. You'll see more and more professors not only being solicited by media, but you'll see graduates and graduate students joining think tanks, NGOs, international organizations, even philanthropic organizations, and other new actors that are now granting support for policy-focused initiatives globally. And actually, for graduate students, I mean, that might be where the jobs are as universities are sort of in crisis globally. So that's something to keep in mind as far as being marketable on the job market. But as much as the gap has narrowed, there are still obstacles that have lingered about this incompatibility between the two worlds of scholarship and policy. And scholars have pointed to four main factors that hinder that relationship. One is the organizational structure of academia that does not always allow policy to be valued. For example, search committees, it's been noted, who often value theoretical advancements more than policy significance. Promotion decisions are based on peer-reviewed publications rather than policy impact or policy-oriented publications such as white papers or policy briefs, etc. And that will, of course, depend on the discipline. You do see increasingly when you do grant applications that you have to explain your broader impacts, for example, as NSF, National Science Foundation, words it that way. But a lot of time it's sort of an afterthought still. The other factor is that think tanks actually have taken over where universities have failed. So they are the ones now doing a lot of this work of liaising with policymakers. They do the research themselves, they do analysis with more direct effect and more connecting to the world. And they can even be activist in nature. So they make it more efficient than perhaps university can. However, think tanks a lot of time are politically biased. They come from a certain range of views of what the world should look like. So what the university tries to do as far as objectivity, whether we can do it or not, I think it's a question that will be treated this week. But think tanks do not have that hurdle. And vice versa, one other organizational structure that has been noted as an obstacle to bridge that gap between policy and university is that the policy world has not necessarily been interested in what goes on in university research or have had no time to pay attention to it. They're less interested in conceptual framings and patterns than the precise problem they have to deal with at the moment. And today, at least in the US, policy and scholars have been able to find common grounds and exchange ideas a lot of time through scholarly associations. I'm speaking from, for example, the American Association of Geography has made efforts to reach out to policy and policymakers and vice versa. And I'm sure it's true of other professional organizations. But the main hurdle is probably the speed of reference and the time frame for work and action reaction that's very different in scholarship and in policy. Policymakers must sometimes act quickly in reaction to occurrences that require urgent solutions. And we can think of the migration crisis in Europe, or the COVID crisis globally. Policymakers often learn about the effects of their policy after they've applied them and after they've seen the results. And on the other hand, scholars ponder on matters and set up these lengthy research protocols. They take time to analyze results. They have to have permission from ethics board. That takes time. They have to come up with conclusions that can be tested. So that can make it hard to inform policy in due time, even if the will is there. So scholars may be less driven by immediate action and less able to give answers quickly because they have different methodologies or ways to go about doing their work and answering questions. So the bottom line is that these two worlds sometimes don't understand each other. And observers have pointed to some misconceptions on each side. First, the belief that policy relevant research is not theoretical or not theoretical enough, and that focusing on policy would make theory less central in disciplines. So people argue about whether that's a valid point or not, and many say that it's not, that you can do theory-focused, policy-relevant work. There is the misconception that scholars are necessarily turned inward because of the nature of the university, whereas policy is turned outward. And in fact, many scholars are increasingly very embedded in the communities they study. Though you have some scholar activists now more and more in social science, and that actually do reach out through their work. Although scientists will keep in mind their desire for some level of objectivity in what they do. So what does policy relevant scholarship look like, and what can practitioners get from theory and academics? And I borrow there from Gentleson and Ratner, who identify 3 dimensions of policy relevant scholarship. First, its diagnostic value. The theory will help us identify patterns and correlations and causations across information that may seem separate at first. And scholars do that maybe better than policymakers who have no time to get back from the small picture to the big picture. It has prescriptive value, so methodology can be helpful for the development of strategies to unroll policy. And finally, it's lesson drawing. So academics are reflective and use theory to highlight patterns beyond each situation, focusing on replicability and applicability, which makes it possible to learn from mistakes as you step back from the issue. So what can we do to enhance our policy reach then? And the first thing would be to get trained in techniques that allow the integration of policy goals in academic work. Graduate students are taking these opportunities very often over the summer with private or public institutes that open up for internships. The EU or other governmental organizations are also welcoming interns in various branches. So those are opportunities to grasp. And that's a great development to help students and even faculty come up with more scenario-based research that, while informed by theory, is also focused on more direct applicability policy-wise. So also you could seek out opportunities to work or publish side by side with practitioners, organize events where both worlds are equally present. That will lead to some key relationship building and synergies being created around common interests and quests. Reward faculty who get involved in policy, including linking it to their teaching through curriculum development. So I'll end here for policy saying that there is maybe a need for introspection about what we do and what our responsibilities towards society at large to participate more directly to solving today's challenges. And again, some disciplines might be doing this more than others. So the idea is to generalize the practice. I will move on now to what does it mean to engage publicly beyond policy. So what does it mean to go public as an intellectual? And I'll focus on three things. So it can involve writing differently, creating different kind of knowledges or through different conduits, and teaching. I've also here borrowed from a geographer, Derek Alderman, that I really encourage you to read about the issue of going public. He developed this concept of going real, which is relevant, engaged, advocating, and life improving. And that's, for him, the leading thread for what scholarship needs to be relevant. The idea is to decenter where knowledge is being produced, accepting that we must co-produce knowledge from the bottom up, taking into account what communities themselves can contribute, and providing opportunities for these local knowledges to be heard and integrated. Public writing is difficult. It asks us to, in a way, unlearn some of what we've been learning. It needs to be recognized as a valuable part of scholars' portfolio so that people will be more inclined to actually take part. It needs to be made accessible. So that's the value of public writing, is that it is accessible to all. So you're writing for a general audience. You have to shed your mind of jargon, which is difficult when we've been ingrained in those conceptualization of our knowledge that is just not accessible to the lay person. So how to think about explaining what you do to somebody in your family who is not in the field. There are many genres in public scholarship. You can not only do public writing in different journals that do this kind of writing, but you can consider podcasts, radio programs, digital projects, film production, documentaries. And through this media, you can also become more of an activist in your scholarship. What I will say is that people who engage in public scholarship have been very rewarded, and they report on it being extremely rewarding as far as their impact that they feel their work is having. So it's the misconception about public writing is that it's not dumbed down science. It's science that is made accessible to non-specialists. Another way that I would also recommend that you could get involved in public writing is through joining editorial committees in journals that do public writing, so you can actually commission work, be part of the editing process and the feeding of content through these journals. And I encourage you once again to, I hate to always plug in Europe Now, but it's a great journal that has been able to mix art, literature, and also science in a way that is accessible to all. Some guidance, if you're interested in getting into public writing, is that you need to keep the audience as your primary focus. You are writing for the public. It's based on research, but it's not a research paper. So you will have to learn to filter your research so that it's actually digestible by somebody who does not have, for example, the theoretical knowledge. It aims at a wide reach, so it is interdisciplinary in nature, and it's also international in nature. You'll have people reading you from all sorts of disciplines and from all sorts of geographies. And again, there's no limit to the genres that you can target, from opinion pieces, letters to the editors. Book reviews are also a good way to translate academic work into something that lay people would not have access to. Know that it's not easy to translate your work so that everyone can understand it. You'll need to adapt your writing style. You'll need to provide context and be clear on your takeaways. Public writing also allows you to be more visible as a scholar, to be more present. So, yeah, Manasi, are you trying to? No. You have to decide how personal and visible you want to become, because that can be a more personal approach. So this is where storytelling comes into play, and I'll speak a little bit about what storytelling the role can serve. It can also help you become a better academic writer. So that's the feedback loops, because you learn to present ideas concisely and in simple ways, and that cannot hurt. So advice for public writing: know yourself, adapt your writing style, know your audience. They are smart, but they're not specialized in your field, and decide how visible you want to be. Focus on storytelling. So this is a term that's been perking up here and there, even on in job searches. You'll find storytelling in even in the very technical job posting. You will find that companies are looking for storytellers to tell their story to the outside world. So that's something that's very present. Stories are powerful messages that can shape policy. They are educational tools that can advance debates because people relate to stories. It gets people attention and it highlights what could be hidden. And Derek Adelman has put it very well, saying stories are important to the efficacy of science. So stories are now gaining value in how we conduct our research, how we deliver our research. And that leads me to creative scholarship, because creating stories is really about being creative.
I request participants to kindly mute themselves.
Please mute yourself. Sorry, Helen.
It's okay. It happens.
Okay. Please continue.
Yeah, Hawkins wrote about the creative turn, and although she wrote about geography, the creative turn, I think, applies to many other social sciences. It's the idea to enhance disciplinary relationships with creative and cultural practices to expand the field of knowledge production. She talks about alternative writing in encouraging scholars to write poetry, to write stories, to draw, use photography in their work, video, public art, or even participate in museum exhibits. So not only using it as object of study, but really as a method, as a delivery method for what we want to do in our own disciplines. And I have worked with, in the journal where I work, I have worked with scholars who are also poets, and who tell me how they struggle to make that part of their scholarship recognized in their own departments, and how they appreciate the opportunity to do both. So something to also consider in the way we can kind of let go of the barriers that we have built around ourselves, that we must be a certain way if we are going to be a scholar. It really invites a new conception of knowledge, a new conception of knowledge production, a more collaborative outlook on knowledge production, where you can work with artists side by side, and access to the sensitive aspects of the world that we all have, but we have sort of muted in the sake of science. So it's also encouraging to developing a more democratic, more less top-down, more participatory processes of knowledge production. And that leads me to sort of the last facet of what I wanted to present today, which is scholars are also teachers. So most of you probably are already teaching or will be teaching at some point. And what we find a lot of time is that teaching is often relegated to a secondary activity that is less valued, less sought after, less prestigious perhaps in some places. Teaching staff is often very overworked, and teaching track in academia, at least in the US, even though that's changing somewhat, is often seen as less desirable. I mean, to be very, very direct, you're usually paid less. You don't have access to the same kind of funding, even if you want to do some research. So it's often seen as the sort of the stepchild of academic jobs. And so changing this culture is also part of going public in the university. And you have now development with these professors of the practice positions that are being developed, but it's still very, very marginal, I would say, as far as a model of career development. So if we also change the way that we look at our students, even undergraduate students, as knowledge producers in their own right, and solution seekers. And the previous speakers talked about how dynamic students are, how innovative they are. And so tapping into that dynamism is really important as teachers. So we can teach them research skills and the scientific method early, even if their skills are not going to be as refined as graduate students or as our own. But they have it in their mind already that they are seekers of solution. Focus on research-based assignments, even if they are very modest in scope. Incorporate digital media because that is what students know best. And they are actually sometimes much better than we are, very savvy. Encourage group work because that will encourage them to develop their collaborative skills and incorporating everybody's knowledges and backgrounds. Also encourage students to publish in student publication. There are a few journals that will take undergrad publications, and sometimes they have to be just supported by their professor. That's a really good way to also train students to become these public scholars. You can also publish with students as co-authors. You can design course and assignment around the big questions of our time because this is what the students want. They want to be useful. They are immersed through their social media in those big questions of the time. And then you can connect to real world for immediate relevance through experiential learning. For example, we talked about it already this morning, field work. You can involve them in your own research very early on by taking them to witness interviews, for example, etc. So this experiential learning by also placing students in NGOs, for example, will also be very valuable experience to train these new generations to become these public intellectuals that the world needs. And in conclusion, I just want to say that to do this kind of work, you have to be brave, try new ways to share your work to make a difference. Consider the responsibility that we have as scholars to publicly engage in a way to give back for the training that we have been lucky to receive, because higher education is not a given for everybody everywhere. Envisage ways that you can co-produce knowledge with non-experts or with generalists to bridge these silo mindsets, and to develop this university as a front porch, to use Alderman and Inwood's word, which is a place where people will drop in, people will discuss ideas, and there is a sort of a blurring of the genres, a blurring of the hierarchies, where everybody is more on an equal footing and everybody has something to contribute and something to be heard about. And I thank you. I really would love to know more about what you do and the way that things are organized and the role that you see for yourself in your career, whether you're established in your career or you are about to start it. And I have my email there. You can email me if you are interested in contributing a piece of public writing to kind of test out the genre for yourself. Email me and you can check out the journal where I'm an editor and see the kind of work that is done there. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me, Manasi. Thanks for all of your help.